Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. John Arquilla is a professor of defense analysis at the United States Naval Postgraduate School and the author of a number of books, including Worst Enemy, The Reluctant Transformation of the American Military. Dr. Arquilla's most recent publication is an article in the current issue of Foreign Policy entitled The New Rules of War, derived, John, from your book, Worst Enemy, or building on the thesis, correct?
That's right.
Victor Davis Hanson is a fellow at the Hoover Institution, a classicist and military historian, and the author of many books, the most recent of which is just out, The Father of Us All, War and History, Ancient and Modern. Segment 1, Have We Got It All Wrong? From John Arquilla's article in Foreign Policy, The New Rules of War. I'm quoting you, John. A decade and a half after a colleague and I coined the term net war, the United States is still behind the curve. Our big ships, big guns, and big battalions are sure to be the wrong approach to waging the wars of the future. Close quote. Let's begin with a definition of a term, which is not just a term, but your thesis for some years now, net war.
It's the way networks make war. And what's a network? It's a loose connection between people. A lot of folks think a network is how you're wired. We think, David Ronfelt and I, who came up with this, think that a network is more like what anthropologists think of when they say networks, the social connections between people, whether they're talking to each other, whether they have runners going between them, or they're using cellular phones. So that's the network. And now what does that imply for warfare?
Mm-hmm. I have to say, when you say network to me, I think immediately Facebook.
Yeah,
or MySpace.
Cyberspace. Yeah, exactly. And that's certainly one of the things that has empowered these social connections, and they've overturned tyrannies in a number of countries, for example, in the last 15 years, which is something that David and I predicted.
The Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
The color revolutions. I think even the breaking of one-party power in the Republic of Korea is a good example of the use of these technologies for social networking. The wires matter, but it's the social connections we thought that were going to be most powerful, and we thought that those who would be most empowered would be the terrorists, particularly, as we wrote back in '96, this little group called Al-Qaeda, which seemed to be very devoted to the idea of creating a global network. So against that, heavy tanks, aircraft carriers and such were going to be very, very bulky, too expensive, and not very effective in taking them down. The real question, however, is does the network scale up to fighting the larger wars that inevitably will come? I know Victor's written about big wars can come again. And surely they will. And my hypothesis is that this new approach will actually do better against old-style big war opponents. It's going to give us a chance to compete with the terrorists.
So you believe that technology has fundamentally altered the terms of engagement now and forevermore, or you believe that the technology has made possible one new form of warfare which is likely to expand and be developed by this or that group alongside what we think of as traditional or conventional warfare?
I think yes to both, if that's okay. Every era of technological change has implied new forms of military organization and new doctrines, just as the tank and the plane and the radio came together to give us blitzkrieg. And you had to have that armored division where you concentrated that hitting power in order to get the maximum effect.
Right.
Well, this is a time where instead of concentrating all your power in one place, you want to distribute it as widely across many nodes as you can. Al-Qaeda has a relatively small number of operatives, but they're spread out everywhere. And one of the things we've learned about this modern globalized world is that the destructive and disruptive power of even very small numbers can be quite great. And this is on the flip side. Of course, Donald Rumsfeld understood this when he came in as Secretary of Defense and suggested that we needed to get smaller, quicker, closer, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the Rumsfeld legacy.
So John is onto something profound there, right?
Yeah, I think he is. I think the question that I don't think anybody would question John's thesis. I think where you'll have people who would be skeptical as to what degree is this antithetical to or come at the expense of more traditional assets, and can these traditional assets be fit into John's model? Because I think John and everybody realize that if tomorrow North Korea comes across the 38th parallel or China storms into Taiwan, we're going to need superior aircraft firepower. And the question is, I think John's making the argument, as I understand it, right, not that you don't need a carrier, not you don't need...
Oh, no, but John is making quite an anti-current Pentagon.
But I don't think necessarily, maybe anti to the further escalation of that type of acquisition and deployment, but I think he's arguing that the air, sea, and military forces, which will be conventional and have to be used in overwhelming number, would have a different imprint to them.
Oh, very certainly they do. It's, you put your finger on the key question, Victor. What do we need to fight the big war? And I've made a point in this article that what we have does not scale down very well. We have to send a lot of troops to go after a few people.
It's pretty provocative here and quite unambiguous. The United States is still behind the curve.
Oh, yeah.
So let me put it to you. In Afghanistan in 2001, we used special forces, a couple hundred guys on horses calling in strikes. That wasn't, and we overthrew the Taliban.
Yeah.
Okay. And in the first 3 weeks in Iraq, we go storming up to Baghdad, topple light force moving very fast, and topple the regime of Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks. So doesn't that indicate that the Pentagon, as currently configured, is at least open to this kind of thinking, right?
No question. In the article, I say we're behind the curve. And what I'm trying to suggest is we live in a time where, unlike the Cold War was characterized by an arms race in nuclear weapons.
Right.
We're now in an era that's characterized by an organizational race to build networks. And it seems to me that that's where we're behind the curve. Yes, we did build a network in Afghanistan, but then after the A-teams left, we went back to building a huge base in Bagram, replete with a Burger King and other amenities, and surging troops out of Bagram to the troubled points, but it would take them many hours to get there, whereas in the first laydown of special forces all over the country, we were able to respond very quickly. And so we slowed ourselves down. We got bigger and slower. That's why I say we have a military that doesn't scale down very well. And I'm thinking that if we build this more networked force, it'll already be able to deal at the irregular level, and I believe it'll be able to scale up very nicely to fight the bigger wars.
John, you organized this, much of your thinking, and certainly the article in Foreign Policy, around 3 epigrams. Many and small beats few and large. Finding matters more than flanking. Swarming is the new surging. Let's take each of these and see what Victor thinks of them. From the New Rules of War, your article here, I'm quoting, the greatest problem traditional militaries face today is that they are organized to wage big wars and have difficulty orienting themselves to fight small ones. Now here, Victor, perhaps, I'm quoting John, perhaps the best example of a many and small military that worked against foes of all sizes, question of scalability, was the Roman legion. Explain that to my classicist friend Victor Davis Hanson.
Well, he can probably explain it to me. The Phalanx was a large single mass, the Phalanx of Alexander. I think one of the reasons, and hopefully you'll come to our school and teach about this, but I think one of the reasons that Scipio wins at the Battle of Zama is that Hannibal is still using that rather bulky phalanx.
Phalanx would be how many men under arms, roughly?
Could it be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000?
At where?
No, in an average phalanx.
Yeah, by the classical times of Phalanx, it should be 6,000.
6,000.
They were 4,500 to 5,000.
Yeah, and a legion often had 6,000 too, but the legion was kind of in checkerboard fashion, and it could reconfigure and reform in many different ways that the phalanx didn't have.
It was the Lego block of ancient warfare.
Nicely
You could
put.
put them
It
together.
combined aerial and hand-to-hand. So a person would throw a pilum, and they would get the advantage of an aerial weapon, and then they would approach with the gladius. And we know from simulations that the gladius had more penetrating power and cutting flesh, double-edged. And there's some graphic descriptions of Cynocephali and the Battle of Pydna, where a phalanx of the Hellenistic brand fought at legion. And the Greeks were shocked at the level of wounds and the type of wounds. They never encountered that before because they were missing, arms, legs that a person could take off. So I think John's right about that. It was a more flexible, it was based on the phalanx per individual unit, and in some ways of shock, because they could get together. And
always, yeah. But they scaled up.
It was flexible.
By the way, John, I think we just discussed Afghanistan and Iraq in the previous segment, and it sounds as though you approve broadly of Donald Rumsfeld.
Very much so.
Rumsfeld understood small, fast, swarm. But the Secretary of Defense is able to impose this on the Pentagon establishment for only so long. And when he has to turn to other matters, because the Secretary of Defense has responsibility for a wide array, and you go back to war making, the commanders in the field, the chain of command, they go back to what they know, which is massive, which is mass, material and mass. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think that what
Rumsfeld's onto something, but the Pentagon
he was,
itself.
and I think that people had seen Panama, and they'd seen Grenada, and they'd seen the Balkan Air Campaign.
Right.
And the idea was...
People, you mean the generals?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea was, if you have a traditional division of 16,000 men, say in 1950, and you have a traditional division of 16,000 men in 2000. Well, the 2000 division, through air support, laptops, can bring an amount of firepower out of a magnitude probably of 1,000, especially when these weapons are laser guided. So the idea was, according to Rumsfeld, as I understood it, why in the world would you want the same number of Crusader platforms or all of these things when through electronic connections, this 16,000 man division can bring a whole array of firepower and become ipso facto 10 times, 50 times more lethal. Now his opponent said, okay, we grant you that. You guys went in and you took out the Taliban, you took out Saddam.
The opponents believe, broadly speaking, in what came to be known as the Powell Doctrine. Colin Powell.
They did.
You go in mass.
But what they did, they tweaked that.
Correct?
Right. Not quite.
All right.
They said that, but there was no criticism of the brilliant 3-week takedown of Saddam or the 6-week takedown of the Taliban by that group. They couldn't say we should have taken 300,000. Where the argument came in, and it was a post facto argument, okay, you guys can use these new connections or networks. However, people are people. Human nature's unchanging. When you want to pacify the countryside, you need boots on the ground. So you need 300. I think John was, and the school that Rumsfeld were arguing is, okay, but the problem was not sheer numbers. It was how this 160,000 who were so brilliant in taking out, a 500,000 man army were used as occupation constables.
Okay,
that's where the key is.
All right, so let me sum up the argument as best I understand it and try another analogy. We're hearing a great deal now about cloud computing, where your software, your documents, and so forth exist. It's all out there. You open the laptop and you can bring them. It's almost as though, in some way, you're arguing that more and more and more, the lethal power of the United States exists in a cloud, and you can put small units on the ground, and they can summon it to strike, strike, strike. Is that something like what you're saying?
It's part of the story.
Or does that apply only to air power, really?
I think it's a good point, because we have artillery and other capabilities that aren't just aircraft that can do that can be. I like the cloud metaphor a lot. I think it's very good, Peter. But I think also these small units I'm talking about can have their own version of the Gladius and the Pilum. There is a right way to equip them so that they are actually very tough in close combat, because the kind of thing Victor's talking about after the Thunder Run to Baghdad was a very traditional close quarters kind of engagement against a people ready to mount insurgency.
All right, now Victor's saying here's where the real argument was, if I understand it correctly. Fine. Move quickly to Baghdad, Rumsfeld, move small, light, fine. Yeah. But then you run into the insurgency. Things go sideways for 3 years, and the argument is we had too few troops on the ground. We went in too light. And that argument seemed to me to gain ground with the public at large, with Capitol Hill, with the press. Yeah. And your argument is it was totally mistaken.
Oh, yeah, without question. I think what happened after that Thunder Run and after the regime was taken down is that the troops who were there were basically concentrated into a few large bases. Here's that few large, instead of distributed in a many and small manner.
Because it was too dangerous to distribute them, right?
Well, I don't think so at all. There were, at the day that statue was pulled down, well over half of the Iraqi people saw the Americans as liberators. It was about a year later that number had dropped to single digits. But we had a great opportunity, and I think it was missed because it was misunderstood at that point. They thought, well, the job is done. The sort of traditionalists thought, well, we ran our blitzkrieg and
so
won.
maybe you don't have a few places of concentrated power, but you disperse units of 50 in 1,000 places across Iraq.
Many and small. And by the way, that's how we ended up doing a lot better in Iraq. In 2004, I started lobbying for an outpost network and talking to the insurgents themselves to get them to switch sides, because over half that population was with us. And by George, that's what turned things around.
Victor's nodding. You agree? You buy all of this, right?
Well,
Or not?
I have a problem with the traditional defense of why the surge worked. People say the surge. I can't think of a war where 30,000 troops made that much of a difference. Yeah. So we go from, 130 to 160 or whatever the numbers were. But there were a lot of other factors. One of them, obviously, is what John's talking about: getting people out. When you went, first time I went to Iraq, I went to a compound. Second time, I rode around a Humvee that went to apartment buildings. So people were out there. Yeah. But there were other classical things that worked that nobody wanted to talk about. One of them was just this number of attrition. I asked one officer, why is things settling down? Why are the people in Anbar? And he said, we've killed a lot of these blank, blank, blank. And after 5 years, there were a lot of tribal leaders who would tell you that they'd lost their son, their cousin, and it was attrition. That helped, and it coincided with the surge in troops. The other was the message that we sent the world and the Iraqis that 30,000 was symbolic, that we weren't going to pull out. But the actual numbers themselves, I don't think, would have been determinate without these other factors going on. Where we are now in the intellectual debate is, I think everybody understands, as I said, that Rumsfeld's doctrine really worked with the Taliban. And then the Kagan school came back and said, no, you needed boots on the ground, and they rejected that. And now we're in a third level of development, and it says the boots on the ground may or may not have helped, but it was how the boots on the ground were used. We didn't take the surge and use them the way that the other first 130,000 were used. We took the surge, and then that surge and the 130 all started acting differently. And that begs the question, had they taken the 130 and had them dispersed out, would they have needed the extra 30?
All right, segment 3, finding matters more than flanking. From your article here, John, The New Rules of War. Ever since ancient times, quote, hitting the enemy in the flank has been the most reliable maneuver in warfare, but the enemy of the future will have to be found before it can be fought. Yeah. Explain that in a few sentences.
Well, look, there's over 24 wars going on around the world today. They're all insurgencies or guerrilla wars or protracted periods of terrorism. And every country where they're fighting, they're vastly outnumbered by the security forces there, police and military. But the problem is you can't find them. And if you can't find them, you can't fight them.
Okay, so what you make the point in this article that as we moved north to Baghdad, the Iraqi army, 400,000 strong, just disappeared.
Mostly, yeah.
And then a lot of those people came back some months later as insurgents. All right. Yes. So what I'm trying to tease out here is what's new about this. Napoleon went into Russia, and the Russians backed up and backed up and backed up and then just disappeared and let winter come in and then started attacking during the long retreat. That's a couple centuries ago. Yeah, Viet Cong, same thing. They'd hit and then disappear into the jungle. So where does the new technology, what's new, what's distinctive about this moment?
Well, this moment is in all these 24 wars, there's no Battle of Borodino as there was when Napoleon invaded Russia. It's as though he went in and he never found anybody, basically.
And so what does this imply for the disposition of forces?
Well, we've reached a point now in the world, given 12 battle carrier groups and this amazingly lethal conventional forces, that it's very hard. Maybe China will change it, but for the near future, people are not willing to have a traditional Western conventional. The last person who tried it was like a turkey at Thanksgiving, Saddam Hussein in '91, and an open flight. He was just obliterated, and Milosevic as well. So the question is, we're not going to get too lucky. We're not going to find an idiot like Milosevic or Saddam. Doesn't mean we don't need those forces. We do, but the enemy has understood throughout 2,500 years there's a formula, a menu to checking conventional Western military power. You can take weapons from the West, be parasitical, IEDs, everything in there is, you couldn't get a Taliban scientist to design any of those components. They're all parasitical.
Taliban scientist is a contradiction.
Anti-war movements at home. Michael Moore was worth in a division, or you could, not him, but Cindy Sheehan in that movement. Or getting France to vote against us in the UN, dividing the West. Or asymmetry, as we talked. You get a guy who's emailing his son every night back in Kansas, and he's an Army colonel, and he gets killed. In human terms, it's still a moral loss, but the way that each side will reckon that loss, the $250,000 for the BA, all of the accoutrements that get that Army guy up. And so what we're seeing in this complex world is that more and more, and this has happened throughout history with the Macedonians or Romans, the Crusaders, there's people who do not want to fight a Western type of war because they understand where it leads. Superior discipline, organization, firepower will destroy them. And they find ways, and they start a challenge and response cycle. And then the West has to come up and say, you know what, we're going to have a conventional military, but we're going to have to divert some of our resources. And that's where the argument goes
so
to counter the counter response.
You mentioned China. He did it, not me. So now let's just go ahead. Because as I read it, I'm a total layman, and if I just am factually incorrect, if I ask a stupid question, tell me it's stupid. If I'm factually incorrect, tell me I'm factually incorrect. But as I read China, they are superb at playing the game of push and retreat. Push and retreat.
Sure.
Diplomatically, militarily, they'll rattle their sabers across the Strait of Taiwan from Taiwan, and we send a carrier group through that strait, and they back up.
The next day they go twice as far than they did the day before.
Exactly. So what has finding matters more than flanking, or small and fast versus big and slow, what has that got to do with China?
Well, I would be very troubled if we got to a point where China were going to invade Taiwan, or let's say they would foment a revolution on the island first and then try to go and aid those who are there. We would send our carriers into the strait. And let me tell you, they wouldn't begin this process unless they had a ready array of the small and the many. That is, these brilliant
The
minds.
Chinese would not.
Oh, yes, they're building a small and many navy right now. As Victor said, they're not building our kind of navy. So they've got a brilliant mind, Peter, that sits down and waits for a big ship to come nearby, and then it maneuvers itself right under the keel of the ship to break its back. They've developed a torpedo that
And
runs
presumably the strait will be filled with that.
filled with it. Supercavitation torpedoes that create a little bubble of air across the front that allows them to travel at hundreds of knots. No countermeasure to that. Supersonic
Hundreds of knots?
Hundreds of knots. Hundreds of knots. No countermeasure.
That's like bullet speed underwater.
And a little bit less, but yeah,
fast.
real fast. And then supersonic anti-ship missiles, which are bullet plus speed. So they're building a capability for that. I would rather go into that war with our own small and many. And I'm pleased to say the Navy is looking in this direction, both with remotely operated vehicles and a variety of other capabilities that maybe we shouldn't talk about too openly right now. But for the most part, the response will be the carrier strike group. And here's basically the way it works. An aircraft carrier strike group has about 90% of its cost dedicated to defending the carrier, about 10% to strike.
One platform is so expensive and so crucial.
$5 billion for the carrier and $20 billion for
Well, the new ones will be
ships.
about $10 billion each.
$20 billion for the group.
Yeah, it's incredibly expensive and increasingly vulnerable, and everyone realizes this. That's why so much expenditure is to protecting the carrier. I'm interested in this. If you get to small and many and think about the finding capability, then you're talking about engaging and protecting Taiwan in a very different sort of way. I think the goal would be the same, right? We have a commitment not to allow that country to be overrun. How we do it, I think, can be far more efficiently, and we can do it far more militarily effectively. And I think China, it's good you raised the subject of China because they are going to be a profoundly improved military power in the coming decades.
Segment 4, swarming is the new surging. Once again, from the new rules of war. Instead of continually surging large numbers of troops to trouble spots, the basic response of a swarm force would be to go swiftly, in small numbers, and strike the attackers at many points. Close quote. Yeah. So, I don't know what you mean in the sense that in reading this article, you make an assertion, you make an assertion, you make an assertion, and I'm able to imagine roughly what that might have meant in Baghdad, say, or Afghanistan.
Well, think about Afghanistan in the beginning.
Okay, so how do we...
They went very, very quickly, and by the way, you'll love the story.
We dropped a bunch of guys in by air, right?
Only because Donald Rumsfeld said, do it. There's a point in my book where the book is really about this debate between the traditionalists and the Rumsfeld view. Rumsfeld basically says, you're going to do this, and Bob Woodward reports this in his account of it. He said some generals just put their heads on the desk when they didn't want to insert the special forces. They wanted to continue the bombing campaign. Anyway, so you take these guys, and we're just talking a month or so after 9/11, and these guys are on the ground.
How many?
200.
200.
11 Special Forces A teams, 200 individuals.
Dropped in 11 quite widely dispersed places.
And you know why they were riding horses in the beginning? It was for identification, friend or foe. That's so our attack aircraft would know if it's on a horse, don't blow it up. If it's in a vehicle, just kill all the vehicles. And the point is they were all
Even
over.
I would have found a way to stay on the saddle in those circumstances.
Well, exactly. And anyway, so they're all over the place. The Taliban don't know where they're going to turn up next, and everywhere they go, these guys are looking at them and calling in coordinates and getting them blown up, and it's an amazing... So that would be an example of swarming rather than surging, and I think it's that will be seen some decades down the road as Rumsfeld's masterpiece. I mean, he was not in office all that long, and he got that campaign pulled together. I'm not a particular apologist for Donald Rumsfeld, but I've only
it's an example
met
of
him
what
on
you're
a few
arguing that we're
occasions.
right.
But this is a guy who saw a glimpse of the future of military affairs.
Swarming is the new surging, Victor?
We're talking about different phases. So I think everybody, this is what's so tragic about American politics. When Donald Rumsfeld, when the Taliban were out, and when the statue fell, Donald Rumsfeld was a rock star. He was on the cover of everybody.
right.
And the people who praised him the loudest would be the people who opportunistically turned on him. So that's another story. But the question is the second phase. Okay, so you swarm these people, and you crack the morale of the enemy, and they filter back out, and they're back into Waziristan, or they're going across the border in Iran. And then you've got to build a civil society.
Because in Afghanistan, as distinct from Iraq, we didn't kill that many of the enemies.
This has
we
been
scared
very
them
important
off. Is
to
that
see,
right?
Because whether you believe in John's view or you're a traditionalist, you have to accept in the postmodern world there are certain limitations on military practice. We can't firebomb Tokyo like they did in March 11th. We can't do it Dresden. We can't do Hamburg. We can't obliterate in the way that, and that is the classic Roman ingredients for a Roman peace, that you obliterate, you humiliate the enemy, and you frighten them so much. I remember I said to him once, how did you land in Tokyo 10 days after the armistice? And he said, they didn't want to look at a B-29. They landed, and I thought, well, didn't they swarm on you or shoot you? And he said, no. We would have gone right back up and started all over again. Well, you can't do that today for a variety of reasons. Interconnected, globalized, international morale, all of these things, good and bad. So what we're talking about now is how can you defeat an enemy when you can't crush him, you can't humiliate him, and you can't have a Roman peace? And the question is, I think John's demonstrated that these network approaches are very effective in taking out really formidable enemies that have all the advantages of terrain, logistics, everything. But where the debate is today is, okay, you defeat these people, you can't humiliate, you can't kill them all. Now how are you going to ensure the victory? And I hear this is where the the traditionalists now say, okay, you guys were brilliant 3 weeks, but you need visible people walking around with Humvees. And that's where we are now. How do you do that? How many numbers? What's the percentage of people per square mile?
And you argue that the swarming approach, or the small approach, works even in establishing the peace.
Yeah, but I think there's a synthesis here that's important. Victor's absolutely right. The 200 individuals of the first phase, the breakthrough in Afghanistan, were not going to be able to secure that society. You do have to have presence in many places. Swarming takes on a different hue in that setting. And I'd say Iraq, late in 2006 and 2007, when we established the hundreds of outposts, was an example of swarming al-Qaeda in Iraq, because suddenly we were everywhere and put them on the run, and that's when the enormous amount of attrition of the insurgents occurred. And so I agree that you have to have more for that phase. The question is, how much more? And as Victor said, the 30,000 surge in terms of historical terms of wars, that's really not a big reinforcement. And my point is, if only 10% of the people in country were going outside the wire into the outposts, you could use them in this fashion with far fewer troops overall.
Segment 5 here, our final segment, alas. I'd like to name actual problems that we face in the world and ask you what our disposition of forces should be. Actually, what I'd like to ask you is how the disposition of forces should be different from what they now are. So we mentioned China earlier. I'd like to go back to that and continue that discussion. John, in your article here, The New Rules of War in Foreign Policy, Current Issue of Foreign Policy, you describe a disagreement you had with the late Vice Admiral Art Zabrowski. And it sounds like it sounds like Victor and Sabrowski have roughly the same position. Victor's saying John's right. In many ways, John's right, but we need those aircraft carriers. And you, John, write, Sabrowski thought network-centric warfare could be used to improve the performance of existing tools, including aircraft carriers. I, John Arquilla, thought that networking implied a whole new kind of Navy. Close quote. Yeah. Describe the Navy we need in the Pacific to deal with China. What would it look like?
Or the Navy we need anywhere. Right now, most of the Navy is concentrated in these 11 carrier strike groups. So it's all the eggs in a relatively small number of baskets. I'd like to see over the coming decades.
You used, by the way, calling them eggs. Churchill had this wonderful phrase as after the Battle of Jutland, that the offensive in the Navy, he was making the point, had become sort of dominant as opposed to the defensive. And he said battleships were now like eggs attacking each other with hammers.
He said Admiral Jellicoe was the only man who could have won or lost the war in one day.
Right. So, but this is your point about the aircraft carriers. They become so fragile now.
Exactly. So the cost of losing any one of them is very, very high. So I want the Navy to move away from the few large platforms to many, many more smaller ones.
Smaller carriers?
Sure, smaller carriers.
Don't we have 10 marine transport carriers?
Yeah, we're moving in this direction already. We have more than enough air at sea, even on these lighter carriers that we're going to have. And
a lighter carrier is what? Is a third of the size of a big carrier?
And about a tenth of the cost.
Yeah. But a third, so it carries couple dozen planes?
It usually transports, say, 5 to 1,000 Marine, 500 to 1,000, 1,500.
So in your Navy of the future, you'd have 0 big carriers and 100 smaller ones?
It's a funny thing. In World War II, we began with only half a dozen carriers. We ended up with 100, and most of them were small carriers. And they ended up playing crucial roles in both the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats, but also in main battle against the Japanese Imperial Fleet at Leyte Gulf. They performed remarkably well. So lighter carriers. Remember now we have missiles that we can shoot off of any kind of platform, including submarines. But also I think the Navy is uniquely poised to take advantage of something that could revolutionize what we call the military-industrial complex. We could make it a military post-industrial complex if we say, look, the next generation of weapons we need needs to be remotely operated, and maybe some of these things should be autonomous, artificially intelligent, like the Aegis system. The Tomahawk missile is a robot already. So I think the Navy, which is very much wedded to these few large platforms, if you took that investment and moved it into these other areas, we would do a far better job of protecting Taiwan. The Chinese wouldn't even think about going after Taiwan.
Okay, so we've talked China in earlier segments. We've talked about Iraq and Afghanistan. What does your theory imply about the best way to handle Iran?
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. Obviously, the situation is one where we cannot feel secure if they acquire nuclear weapons for reasons sort of beyond...
Whoa, you're a pretty hard line on that one. So you don't want them to have nuclear weapons, full stop.
Well, do you?
No, I don't, but all kinds of people. General Abizade has said, I can't remember the quotation exactly, but he said, we can live with a nuclear Iran. Isn't that close to the quotation?
He said they were subject to the traditional laws of containment, which I don't think that they are.
Well, what if they downstream one of these weapons to a network? See, my problem is
I'm with you.
If there's ever going to be a nuclear Napoleon, he'll be in a terror network. Here you have a society with a clear relationship with the terror network, Hezbollah, which, by the way, held its own pretty well with swarming style against the Israelis a few years ago. Assume they get their hands on 1 or 2 weapons. What do you do in that situation? How do you have mutual deterrence of a network? That's my concern. So I don't think Iran should get these weapons, and I think...
Let me put it to you this way. Yeah. I understand, because I've been well informed by a certain military analyst called Davis Hanson.
I've heard of him.
That the military options for dealing with Iran right now are very few and very costly and very risky. And basically what it comes down to is we don't know too much about where their nuclear program is. So to be sure of whacking it, you've got a lot of bombing missions, so a couple of weeks of bombing.
I said that was a terrible choice, but it was only better than the other choice.
Yeah,
of allowing them to get them.
No, all I'm trying to argue. I'll stop arguing and let you make it. But as I understand it, that's really the option we face. Is
No.
there some way we or the Israelis could adopt some of these?
I think
Go
the
ahead.
new rules of war suggest a number of ways to
Let's
go
hear
at
'em.
the,
I'd love
at
to.
the problem.
Okay.
Well, first of all, we have to deal with the problem that the Iranians have an explicit swarm doctrine in the Persian Gulf. They do their exercises. They put like 1,000 guys on whalers, with
Little Zodiac
explosives.
boats
Yeah,
almost.
Exactly. And as Admiral John Bastiani, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, this is the thing that worries him the most in the world. So whatever we do is going to require a naval presence in the Persian Gulf. So first thing, we have to counter the Iranian swarm. The 1,000 points of light bombing campaign, I agree with Victor, is not likely to work. But I think there is, under existing international law, an ability that we have to maintain the continuity of safeguards under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that means that we should have the ability to secure some site for inspection at a time and place of our choosing. And if, in the world we live in today, if we were able to do this by these small and special means that we talk about here, and come out with a smoking calutron to show the world that look what the Iranians were doing here, then you have the entire world with you. So I'm not saying don't have a big invasion, don't have a big aerial bombing campaign, but use the small and the many to wrong
So
foot.
what does that mean?
What it
10
means is
raids in the middle of the night on different sites?
You have to insert people in a manner and at places on the basis of good intelligence at which they will come out with evidence of.
We do that, or does the Israelis do it?
Oh, I'd say we would do it.
Victor?
Well, I don't think it's politically tenable. I don't think this administration.
In this administration.
Yeah, I mean, last time we did that, remember 1980 with Jimmy Carter, when we had a great plan. It was just poorly executed. It's very difficult to do.
To get the hostages out of Iran.
Yeah, I mean, we had a forward
And the helicopters
base.
crashed in the
Yeah, I mean, it's doable, but the problem with all of that is that it requires a political organization, a political administration that starts with the premise that it might not work and is willing to take that risk. And it doesn't seem to me that we're willing to do that. The only chance I think that we had a nonviolent was to really get out in front of the protest. I mean, as I said earlier, George Bush would not have been able to appeal in a magnetic, charismatic fashion the way Barack Obama did, but he voted president last summer when those demonstrations took place. That would have been a disruptive if we had a guy like Obama supporting grassroots democracies. That would have been sent a lot of confusing signals.
Let me ask this question. We have Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense. He's announced an end to the production of the F-22 fight. No more F-22 fighters. He's eliminating certain Army armored vehicles. He's overturned plans to build missile defenses in Eastern Europe. We have President Obama. Gates is a Republican. Obama's a Democrat. Let's just say 5 years from now, into the next administration, maybe it's Barack Obama for a second time, maybe not. If I got the two of you back here, would you say that the Pentagon had done a good job of incorporating John's ideas, or are you concerned instead that there's too much old-fashioned thinking, too much of a political overhang, and we'll still be behind the curve? Victor?
It's going to be dependent not on the argument of counterinsurgency or Iraq or Afghanistan. John's group and his thinkers are going to have to persuade the traditional bureaucracy that this networking approach in conventional term, if I could use that term, will work better against North Korea, China, because I think everybody understands we don't want to fight the last war.
Last question. Can you do what Victor said you need to do? Are you going to be able to persuade the Pentagon?
Well, I think we already have with an officer corps in the middle ranks right now. They all, what we call the 03s and 04s, the captains and the majors, all sort of understand this, and they're very good networkers. One of the best things they did in Iraq was create something called companycommand.com, where all the captains talk to each other. This works, that doesn't work, and best practices were moving overnight. And 5 years from now, well, they won't be generals yet, but if you are willing to go out 10 years, that generation all gets it. So we'll be doing a lot more of this. But Victor's absolutely right. The challenge is, can this approach work in a big war? And I think it can.
All right. As so often in American military history, we must place our faith in the captains. A little in the colonels, not so much in the generals. John Arquilla, Victor Davis Hanson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge on the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.